I do. I think people who are interested in the works of people like Jean-Paul Sartre, all right, with his book Being and Nothingness. If you're interested in the works of Martin Heidegger, Being and Time, this is the sort of classic one, and then also Joan Stambaum, her new translation, which I think is potentially confusing compared to the earlier translation, but I do think it's worth checking out the difference there. When you look at the works of the great existentialists and the great phenomenologists and those people who, by their own lights, are doing fundamental ontology, are trying to deal with ontological issues, and part of what they're trying to suggest, and carefully go reread Being in Time, Being in Nothingness. I don't think this isn't my position. I'm just trying to clarify for people who haven't yet had a chance to either refresh themselves on Being in Time or Being in Nothingness. In Being and Nothingness, Sartre's notion of it's actually a tripart ontology. It's often confused. People think it's both just the being in itself and being for itself. It's actually being in itself, being for itself, and being for others. They're trying to suggest that if you begin with the visually identifiable person as if it were just already within zoological classification scheme, as if you're just going to move out of what Heidegger, or if you're just going to move out of this sort of view of the world as if it were made up of things, you may not understand the being of humans, of who they really are, what it means to be human, not what it means to know. See, when somebody says epistemology comes prior to ontology, well, they say, well, how do I know? Well, they're already assuming that there is an I there. And then, well, what do they mean by that? See, the phenomenologist, the existential philosopher, they're interested in the question of meaning. So I would begin with the question of, so what do you mean by the word know? What do you mean by the word I? Those to me are more provocative than how do I know and what are the limits on my ability to know. So much of epistemology, from my perspective, moves out of the misplaced concreteness of an already given individual. The notion of a pre-existing individual as given by the I, as some sort of visually isolatable substance that's a self-sustaining entity that moves around through space, those notion of a person, those are for for people like Heidegger and for Sartre, those are very problematic. I mean, the reason that Heidegger chooses the word Dasein is that he sees the notion of the word human as already problematic. Human looks like you're just sort of in a third party seeing all of the different organisms on the planet, and you're just putting them in a zoological classification, and humans are just right in there. There's a category mistake that goes on when you do that. I mean, if all the other animals were making their own little charts like that, well, then that would be more justified. But we're missing the being of humanity, the invisible connectedness, and the countless relations to history that transcend what you could see in the visual eye, what you could see right here, right now. See, so much of why Heidegger and Sartre as well want to deal with time as the clearing for the meaning of being. If you want to say, what do we mean by the word being, well, you're going to have to be able to make clear an adequate conception of time and temporality. So much of these kinds of conceptions are what make possible epistemological claims. When people, they want to move into some sort of philosophical debate about how a person makes a claim to knowledge, once you're going to make a certain assumptions that a person is a discrete individual and what you mean by a person, how old are they, what are the legal, as you move into questions of concretizing what that is, well then yes, you can make all these, let's be very, very concerned with epistemology, but to not begin with the ontological question of what does it mean to be human. Is there a radical difference in the very being of humans? Like for example, in Heidegger, he suggests that there are three different kinds of being within the natural world. There is what he calls the extants, and the extants just refers to materiality, things that were neither born nor die. They don't have stages of development, they don't have maturation periods, they don't have, properly speaking, a kind of life cycle. You could think about, an object. Tables and chairs could be a classic example. Pens, artifacts. Then there are, artifacts gets tricky. See, antiques are going to get very tricky here for Heidegger. But then there are the living, right? Living are those things isn't the right word. Living are those entities which are characterized by biological beginning and biological cessation, characterized by various metabolic processes of exchange, growth, development, transaction with their environment. But existence is a word that Heidegger reserves for humans. He says only humans exist. So when he says, tables and chairs don't exist, he's not denying. See, there's people who don't understand what he's saying. He's not denying the being of tables and chairs. He's trying to differentiate different kinds of being and saying that existence is not the proper word to use to designate what a table or a chair is. Existence properly designates the human, and in designating the human, existence is a statement about a throne project that concernfully stretches itself along. Yeah, it's a concernfulness, it's an openness. Humans are clearings of care, and we're clearings of care by historically dwelling, right? For Heidegger, the reason he would prefer a kind of Dasein is not only are we social in our being, and some of this gets very tricky on what authentic Dasein is for Heidegger, but for Heidegger, historicity and sociality, they're not something over against an individual. See, I think part of the problem with the zoological classification is that it really struggles in its notion of sociality. See, I think when people talk about what sociality is, so often category mistakes are made. And they go, well, birds are social, humans are just social the way other creatures are social. I don't think that that's true. There are different kinds of sociality. The very being of sociality is different in human historicity and in language. Language is a genetically endowed, and in that sense, we're genetically social for the acquisition of language in a natural way, but that is a kind of hardwired plasticity for the fall into historicity, right? I guess part of the real struggle is to acknowledge that humans, they're partly extant, we're made up of extant materials, and we live as animals, but existence is what properly characterizes humanity. And to try to get at existence, we're going to have to reckon with so much of our being. And then once we get clear on what it is to be human, what it means to say, I am, then sure, let's talk about all the epistemology we want to talk about. But I would begin with ontology. Okay, thanks.